I'm Ken Lammers, and welcome to this week's LexCast. Today what I'm going to discuss is the differences and similarities between Catholic doctrine on the death penalty and the death penalty statute in Virginia. I'm not going to talk about the underlying reasons for this. Those of you who are from Virginia know why I got interested in this. Those of you who aren't, go look at one of the Virginia political blogs and you'll figure it out pretty quick. What I'm going to discuss is the breadth of both the canon about the death penalty and the breadth of the Virginia death penalty statute. And I think they overlap somewhat, and how I think that both of them are in their own ways broader than the other. And with that said, let's go. Okay, first of all, what I'm going to discuss is what's in the death penalty statute in Virginia. And the death penalty statute in Virginia is Section 18.2-31. It lays out all the circumstances upon which someone can be killed by the government. There are 12, actually 13 are laid out, but one of them pretty much covers a very similar coverage. And what you have is abduction to get money, murder for hire, killing while imprisoned, killing in a robbery, killing in a rape, killing a police officer, killing more than one person. There's two different ways you can qualify under that. Killing during drug distribution, killing a pregnant woman, killing someone under 14, and killing as part of a terrorist act. And those are the basic conditions for the death penalty in Virginia. Yeah, I know that's incredibly oversimplified, that there's a huge body of case law and, some conditionals on each one of those conditions that I put out. But basically, those are the reasons that the government can seek to kill someone in Virginia who's a defendant. Now, if we look at the catechism, the sections which are pertinent to this discussion are 2265, 2266, and 2267. Now, 2267 is the one you hear about all the time, but the other two kind of set up the discussion. Now, 2265 talks about how the government has a legitimate duty to defend its citizens, basically. Or, how I have a legitimate duty to defend someone who's lesser than me and in trouble, or somebody who I can help who's in trouble. 2266 talks about how the government has a right and a duty to impose proportionate penalties, and how the purpose of these penalties is to actually put things back in order, and how, if at all possible, the penalties should also be used to correct the person who has committed the offense. Actually, the exact quote is, "Punishment then, in addition to defending public order and protecting people's safety, has a medicinal purpose. As far as possible, it must contribute to the correction of the guilty party." So then we move on to the section that directly addresses the death penalty. And I'm going to read this in its entirety so that you can get the whole feeling of it. 2267. Assuming that the guilty party's identity and responsibility have been fully determined, the traditional teaching of the Church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty, if this is the only possible way of effectively defending human lives against the unjust aggressor. If, however, non-lethal means are sufficient to defend and protect people's safety from the aggressor, authority will limit itself to such means as these are more in keeping with the concrete conditions of the common good and more in conformity with the dignity of the human person. Today, in fact, as a consequence of the possibilities which the state has for effectively preventing crime by rendering one who has committed an offense incapable of doing harm without definitely taking away from him the possibility of redeeming himself. The cases in which the execution of the offender is an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically non-existent. Okay, so when we look at the statute and compare it to what's in the Catechism, Catholic doctrine, I think what we see is a difference in focus. The Catholic doctrine looks forward. It says, okay, he's done this. You can kill him, the government can kill him, if he is going to do it again. If he is going to cause danger to the community in the future. But it also expresses a hefty amount of skepticism that under modern conditions, where there's things like supermaxes and things, that someone will continue to be that kind of danger to the community. The Virginia statute, however, for the main part, looks backward. It looks back at, what was the cause? Did the man kill a police officer? Did the man kill somebody under 14? Did the woman kill somebody as part of a robbery? That sort of thing. It is looking back at what happened in order to determine whether or not someone is eligible for the death penalty. Now, of course, future dangerousness is argued all the time. You never seen somebody as concerned for the life of a prisoner, other prisoners, as a prosecutor who's trying to get a future dangerousness finding for someone who's going to spend the rest of his life in jail if he's not killed. But, beside the point, there is at least one thing in the statute that I think is pretty clearly about future dangerousness. If you kill someone when you're in prison or jail, then you're subject to the death penalty. And while, again, I am not naive enough to believe that that's meant to protect other prisoners, it's a good side effect. It's meant to protect guards, counselors, wardens, doctors, anybody who works in the prisons or jails. It's meant to protect them. And what it does is says if somebody does kill somebody in prison or jail, what's the guarantee that they won't do it again? For instance, even in a supermax, if you let the guy out for an hour a week and he walk around by himself out in the yard, and he refuses to come back in, well, unless you put some sort of shock collar on him or something, or you're going to shoot him with a knockout dart, which I guess are possibilities, you're probably going to more realistically end up sending in a team to take him back to his room if he won't go back. So that person can remain a danger, and therefore a death penalty there would be future-looking, at least partially future-looking. Now, what we see, the arguments made pro and con all the time, well, the arguments we see made in favor of the death penalty by people who want to say that the Catholic Church, despite what's pretty clearly been the trend in the modern age, that the Catholic Church is actually pro-death penalty, or at least that the death penalty as applied is viable under Catholic teaching. They've come up with a number of arguments, and most of them really just don't fly. Oh my God, this guy could get out and when he's 65 as a geriatric release on parole, and he could kill again, or something like that. Despite the fact, I think the quote I read was that since 1995, 2 whole people in Virginia have been let out on geriatric release, and neither had a violent crime. Now, that's hearsay. Anybody has better figures, I'll be happy to hear them. But you hear arguments like that, or you hear arguments where, well, in the 15th century, the church was fine with the death penalty. Well, I don't know if that's true or not. As anyone who's been on my blog a couple times has seen, and there was one point where I pointed to a post which said that, pointed to some article or post that said that Voltaire is the one who actually kind of turned the tables and started saying, yeah, the church is responsible for the death penalty. whereas it might have actually been a force that mitigated against the penalty. Still, your situation in the 15th century when you're in a peasant's village that's 50 miles from anything else, and you got somebody who's killed while stealing and has made a living doing this sort of thing, and who's going to do it again when you let him out, well, the death penalty then makes a lot more sense, because you don't have jails, you don't have prisons. You may have a dungeon somewhere, but that's probably reserved for people who pissed off the king. But because you have a lack of options, the death penalty becomes the option in all felony cases, because it is much more important at that point to stop that person from being capable of doing things such as an arson who burns down half the village and causes people to starve because grain stores are destroyed, or steals cattle which people need to survive through the winter, that sort of thing. Death penalty becomes much more of an important thing in that situation, because you want to stop that person from ever doing that again. Whereas in the current era, of course, as I said before, you have things like supermaxes. For instance, Virginia had 2 supermaxes, although one of them now has been scaled down to a lower level prison because they couldn't fill both supermaxes, and they put out-of-state prisoners in the supermax who weren't supposed to be there, and it caused a big fuss. So they eventually had to change one of them back to a regular prison. Anyway, the argument that actually makes some sense and can get some traction, at least when you look at it to begin with, is that the death penalty and its application is rare. It is actually very rare. If you look at the number of cases that are brought year after year after year, even in places where the death penalty is thought to be, pretty commonplace, Virginia, Texas, that sort of thing, it's an extremely rare occurrence that someone is actually sentenced to the death penalty and that they actually carry through on it. Problem is, that's not what the test is underneath the catechism. The Catholic doctrine, the test is not that it's rare alone. The test is absolute necessity, as I read to you before. Is it absolutely necessary to kill this person in order to keep him from doing this sort of thing again in the future, harming others, damaging others in the future? And the fact that death penalty usage in, say, Virginia is rare doesn't mean, say someone killed a 13-year-old kid, or somebody killed, somebody, shot somebody during a robbery or something like that. The fact that that person's sentenced to the death penalty, and that it's rare that people are sentenced to death penalty for that, doesn't track with it being absolutely necessary that they be sentenced to the death penalty to keep them from doing that sort of thing again. So it's not a really solid argument. As I said, there is some overlap in the statutes and in what the church believes. For instance, the killing of a guard at the prison, which would be indicative of future dangerousness, which could very well be a reason for the death penalty, but would make it very, very rare. Comparatively to what we do now, it would make the death penalty almost non-existent, which is what the Catechism calls for. So that's where the situation stands. And if you're trying to argue that mere rarity makes the death penalty okay. However, taking a step back from that reality, let's talk about what makes the two of them broad over each other. The breadth of the two, the Virginia statute versus the canon, versus the catechism, the canon. The Virginia statute is broader than what the church calls for, in obvious reasons, what I've been alluding to and saying out loud for the last few minutes, in that it allows the government to kill people because they have done something, such as kill a kid, and something which they, probably wouldn't do again in the future, because how are they going to get the opportunity to kill a kid when they're locked in prison for the rest of their life? Same thing with a robbery. They're not going to commit another robbery while they're in prison, that sort of thing. So it is it's broader than what the church would allow, because it allows these sort of things. On the other hand, if you read through what I put to you on the catechism, the church doesn't limit the death penalty to merely murders. For instance, and I can think of now, I'm going to list a parade of horribles here, but, say you have somebody who's, a serial rapist. He's raped people out in the world. He gets stuck in for 50, 60, 70 years. He keeps raping anybody he can get his hands on in prison, which I know is disgusting, and I apologize for bringing it up. But, that person is somebody who perhaps, again, you have the supermax option, but say if you're in a state where there is no supermax, that might be someone where the death penalty is an option that the church would say would be okay, because you're protecting people from future damage, harm. You also have a position where someone attacks the guards constantly, but this is some guy who's very well trained in combat, and he doesn't go to kill, he goes to paralyze, and he has paralyzed one guard or two guards, quadriplegic, or just, making them unable to use their legs ever again or something like that, and shows no intent not to do it in the future. He gets mad at the guards, or he's trying to threaten guards to get what he wants. He's going to do it again in the future. He's not going to murder him, though, because he knows that a murder gets him death penalty. Well, that's another situation where the church would say, or as I read that catechism, there would be a position where it would go, okay, that's a person who the death penalty could be applied to. And a more perhaps pertinent example would be something along the lines of terrorism. Say somebody found some new terrorist organization, the Brown Crusade, and he starts bombing places, or he doesn't do it himself, but he arranges for places to be bombed. He gets arrested, is thrown in jail. He can still contact his people. He can still inspire people. He could be the root of all sorts of problems in the future, which could cause dozens or hundreds or thousands of people to die. There's a situation where, again, I think the church's doctrine is broad enough that this person could be killed by the government, whereas under the doctrine of under the statutes in Virginia, he couldn't be. So that's where I think they're both broader than each other in certain ways. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think I'm going to wrap it up today. I hope that's been somewhat insightful. I don't claim to be an expert on either canon law or on the Virginia's death penalty. It's not an area of law I practice in a whole lot. This is just kind of my comments upon what I've seen and what I've read. So if you're interested, I encourage you to go in and do some research on your own. And ladies and gentlemen, with that, I wish you a good week. Bye now.